Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I know the news around Ukraine are wild. Ukraine has sunk another Russian battleship. Great news. Micro Johnson again blocking aid for Ukraine in US House of Representatives. I'm really hoping that this week my colleagues on YouTube will help cover these news. So follow someone like Jake Bro for that. But for the time being, for me, I'm a little bit too busy, but I still want to bring something that will really elevate the understanding of you of the situation in Ukraine. And we're going to be talking about General Syrsky today. The BBC service in Russian made this great article about who General Syrsky is and his history, so I auto-translated it, and now I will just narrate it. So excuse for the poor translation, sometimes it's auto-translated. And the second part of this video that I will make later will be talking about the team that General Syrsky has brought in to the Ukrainian armed forces. So, mathematician of war. Who is the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky? It's going to be interesting for you because this article is actually not available in English at all. So maybe you didn't even know that it existed. The BBC talks about who the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine is and what can be expected from his appointment. Acquaintances of Alexander Syrsky say that he nips any talk that the war may not end with the victory of Ukraine. He looks at the war mathematically. For him, this is a problem that needs to be solved, and he's determined to do it. The conditions of this task: there is an enemy, he must be destroyed, says former Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Maler, who worked closely with Syrsky in her line of duty. He plans military operations so carefully that each of them has a day and hour when they should begin and when they should end. Just as an orchestra has every instrument in its part, so it has every division and its task, she continues. After the contradictions between Vladimir Zelensky and Valery Zaluzhny became obvious, most Ukrainian and foreign observers predicted the appointment of Syrsky as the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. Two of Ukraine's biggest victories in the current war against Russia are associated with his name. The biography and experience of the 58-year-old general spoke in favor of his appointment. Critics of his appointment draw attention to the ambiguous reputation of the new commander-in-chief among the troops and argue that in the current situation, any replacement of the commander of the armed forces of Ukraine is not capable of significantly changing the situation on the battlefield, but exposes the Ukrainian government to serious political risks. From Moscow to Kiev. Alexander Syrsky was born in 1965 in the village of Novinky, Vladimir region of the Russian Federal Soviet Republic, something like this. His father was military man, and the boy dreamed of following in his footsteps since childhood. In the 70s, Syrsky's father was transferred to serve in Ukraine, and the whole family moved with him. Alexander graduated from a school in Kharkiv, which he considered his hometown. There are relatives left in Vladimir, but his brother Oleg Syrsky told the Russian state agency, "I don't communicate with him, I don't even know where he is. Don't know anything about him. It's been a long time since he went there," he means to Ukraine. "He's been there all his life. He started his service there and continues that he has a family there." Judging by the social networks, Oleg supports the Russian invasion, which is a very common thing because before Putin made this whole narrative, there was a lot of interconnection between both Ukrainian and Russian families. It is not uncommon to see some native Ukrainians in the Russian military, even in command positions, and so seeing Syrsky, a Russian-born, inside of Ukrainian military is also not uncommon. As an excellent student, Alexander Syrsky was sent to the Moscow Higher Combined Arms Command School, from which he graduated with honors in 1986. Syrsky studied at MVOKU school from 1982 to 1986. The former commander of the 58th Army and now State Duma deputy and one of the main Russian military speakers, Andrei Kartapolov, studied with him at the same time but graduated from college a year earlier in 1985. In 1987, State Duma deputy from the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is not liberal and not democratic, Andrei Lugovoy, who was accused of poisoning Alexander Litvinenko, graduated from Moscow Higher Educational Institution. But Alexander Syrsky military service has already completely connected with Ukraine. In the 80s, he commanded a motorized rifle platoon based in Lubny, Poltava region. Then already in the 90s, a battalion and a regiment of the 6th Division of the National Guard, which were stationed in the Kharkiv region in the 2000s. In the 2000s, he headed the headquarters and commanded the 72nd Brigade, from the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In the 1996, he graduated with honors from the Academy of Armed Forces of Ukraine and in 2005 from the National Defense Academy of Ukraine. In Ukraine, he defended his dissertation and became a candidate of military sciences. In 2009, by decree of President Viktor Yushchenko, Syrsky received the rank of Major General. So he has been a Major General since 2009. In 2013, the last year of peace for Ukraine, Syrsky was the first deputy head of the main command center of the Ukrainian armed forces. In this position, he was in particular responsible for the cooperation of the Ukrainian army with NATO and the implementation of part of the alliance standards in the armed forces of Ukraine. People who know Syrsky say that he speaks English fluently, and before the Great War, he studied with teachers. Now he continues to teach him on his own. So something about Syrsky from my side that I want to add is that yes, it's something that both I missed and a lot of other people's missed, is that Syrsky was actually the front runner for the Ukrainian military to implement NATO standards in the Ukrainian military. So the whole notion that he's this Soviet general that doesn't know what's happening is, again, built on a flawed perspective. So something just to know about him right away. Exit from Debaltseve. After the outbreak of hostilities in Donbass, Syrsky, after the Russian invasion in 2014, to be precise, I'm going to correct the Russian BBC service here, Syrsky became the chief of staff of the ATO. So ATO is the anti-terrorist organization that Ukraine conducted in 2014. It wasn't declared as a war because of political reasons at the time, but it was called the anti-terrorist operation. And Syrsky was the head of that anti-terrorist operation, essentially resisting the Russian invasion. And he was the chief of staff of the anti-terrorist operation until the 2018. This was the official name of the... Oh yeah, it even explains here. In February 2015, Syrsky personally came to the vicinity of the small town of Debaltseve in the Donetsk region. The hottest battles of the entire anti-terrorist operation period were in a full swing here. Debaltseve and surrounding villages seemed to crush into territories controlled by the Russian forces. The armed forces of Ukraine tried to hold the city, which could become a springboard for further attacking actions. The militants, who were already openly supported by the regular Russian military, the tankers from Buryatia were first recorded fighting on the sides of the DPR. They wanted to cut off the Debaltseve ledge. Initially, the purpose of Syrsky's arrival was to understand the situation. In the end, it was he who commanded some of the military clashes and later coordinated the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the city. Russian propaganda described the abandonment of the Ukrainian forces of Debaltseve as a stampede, accompanied by the numerous casualties. Syrsky later insisted the retreat was carefully planned and well organized. With my units, I occupied two heights along the road along which the exit was made. They were occupied by paratroopers. Paratroopers, he means the special forces, like these VDV forces, which were used to be. Now it's storm forces. It's a complicated. It's like analog of VDV, but only in Ukraine. but auto translate to paratroopers here. And they held two tight virtually until our units completely left Debaltseve. At the time of exit, all the main strongholds of the units of the enemy were suppressed, and he was unable to adequately react to our exit. Therefore, the exit was carried out in an organized manner, on foot or in cars, but in an organized manner, he later told Ukrainskaya Pravda. The Debaltseve operation also had a political dimension. During the days of the fighting for Debaltseve, a meeting of the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France took place in the capital of Belarus. On it, Vladimir Putin argued that thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded in the Debaltseve cauldron, and in order to save their lives, Kyiv must make serious concessions. Yes, this is the stain of shame on Merkel, and I don't remember, was it Macron at that time or not, but definitely the stain of shame of how basically Ukraine was pressured by the Western forces to capitulate to Russians inside the awful Minsk agreements. We as Europe are paying for it now. It could have been all prevented. The retention of the city. Oh, and just to kind of underscore, if we're not paying what we must now, then in future we're gonna pay even more, just to make it absolutely clear. The retention of the city until the end of the Minsk negotiations, and later the more or less organized withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from the Debaltseve, was apparently positively assessed by then leadership of Ukraine. For these events, SYRSKY was awarded the Order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky of the third degree. It's a pretty nice recognition of the military prowess. Later, SYRSKY held senior positions in the command structure of Ukrainian troops in Donbass. He headed the Joint Operation Headquarters of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, was the command of the anti-terrorist organization, and later the Joint Forces Operation that replaced the anti-terrorist operation. Yes, so at first it was the anti-terrorist organization, which I talked about. Later it was renamed because it was not just the armed forces of Ukraine that were participating there. It was also command like of the air forces, also the special forces. So, and because of that, they renamed the command to be the Joint Forces Operation. In August 2019, President Volodymyr Zelensky appointed Alexander SYRSKY commander of the ground forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. On August 23, 2020, on the Independence Day of Ukraine, SYRSKY received the rank of Colonel General. Defense of Kyiv. Shortly before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, SYRSKY himself proposed to the country's leadership to appoint him commander of the defense of Kyiv. Later, the general admits that he did not believe that the Russians would so blatantly attack the capital of Ukraine. It seemed to me that if this active hostilities began, it would most likely be in the east with the border of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, or somewhere nearby, he said in an extensive interview with the Washington Post. But we are military, so no matter what I believed or I didn't believe or what I looked like, I still made all the necessary preparations, he continued. To protect Kyiv, SYRSKY organized two defense rings, one inside the city, the other in the suburbs. The general quickly created a system of communication between the central command and the sectors into which he divided the city and its environs. At the same time, it enabled officers on the ground to make immediate tactical decisions. Realizing that regular military personnel may not be enough to protect Kyiv, large forces were deployed to the east of the country. SYRSKY ordered the creation and deployment of temporary battalions to the capital based on training centers and military universities from other cities in Ukraine. In addition, army, aviation, artillery units, and air defense systems were withdrawn from their usual locations on the eve of Russian invasion. All these steps made it possible to withstand the initial blow of Russians, who SYRSKY later said were given no more than 3 days to capture the Ukrainian capital. The BBC's interlocutor, who was then at one of the command posts in Kyiv, said that for the first time after the Russian invasion began, SYRSKY went to sleep only on the 4th day after it started. 2 weeks with almost no sleep. In fits and starts. But all the tasks were completed. He later recalled the documentary Battle for Kyiv. Another moment when situation near Kyiv was critical, SYRSKY called the battles near the village of Moshchun in the north of the capital, where several important roads converged. The Russians bought about 200 pieces of equipment there, filled with paratroopers and marines. Then a key decision was made for the defense of Kiev, blowing up the dam of the Irpin River, stopping the planned attack by the Russians. And it is very likely that it was the decision that finally diverted the danger from Kiev. In the last days of March, Russian troops withdrew from the Ukrainian capital. For this operation, which lasted more than a month, Alexander Syrsky was awarded the highest state award of the state, the Golden Star of the Hero of Ukraine. Offensive near Kharkiv. After the Russian retreat from Kiev, the main events of the war moved to eastern Ukraine. Syrsky headed the operational strategic groups of the troops Khortytsa, whose area of responsibility was the eastern sector of the front. Syrsky is called in the architect of the Slobozhansk offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces. In September 2022, the Ukrainian army quickly liberated more than 500 settlements in the Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. The Ukrainian military then was tired of retreating. We felt that we needed to strike such a blow somewhere that the enemy would stagger and crumble, Syrsky later recalled in an interview with TSN. The Ukrainian government then actively announced through all possible information channels an imminent offensive in the southern direction and forced the Russians to withdraw some of their combat-ready troops to the Kherson region. The forces under the command of Syrsky took advantage of the resulting weakening of the enemy in a Kharkiv direction. Contrary to the expectations of the Russians, who were preparing for a frontal attack on the front line Bakalia at the time, Ukrainian troops bypassed the city and struck from the flank, catching and defenders by surprise. Syrsky, pursuing the retreating Russians, decided to deviate from the initially approved plan, which included a transition to defense, and ordered to move after the fleeing enemy. The Slobozhan offensive brought a huge amount of captured military equipment to the Ukrainian forces. The Wall Street Journal, based on data from Oryx analysts, reported that the Russian army became the main supplier of the heavy weapons for the Ukrainian armed forces. The result of the offensive was much greater than we expected. We planned to liberate about 2,000 kilometers less, Syrsky said later, smiling. But the main result of this operation, according to the general, was different. Everyone saw that the Russian army, the supposedly second army in the world, was victorious, that it can and should be defeated, that they run away and quite quickly. It is believed that these successful actions of Ukrainian forces were the main reason for Vladimir Putin's announcement of partial mobilization. It was possible to stop the advance of the Ukrainian armed forces towards Svatove and Kremina only by throwing thousands of untrained mobilized recruits to the front line. Bakhmut question. While the Slobozhan offensive undoubtedly became one of the most glorious pages in the war against Russia for the Ukrainian army, it is difficult to unequivocally assess the battle for Bakhmut. Syrsky himself admitted that this city, which was under the responsibility of the group under his command, was not significant military interest. However, in the fall of 2022, it turned out that its capture took fundamentally important for the Russian troops. It represented the primary by detachments of the Wagner private military company. The battles for Bakhmut essentially became a personal PR project for the Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, and its conquest was supposed to symbolically compensate for the failure of Russian troops in the Kharkiv region. As a result, already in the winter of 2022-2023, the Battle of Bakhmut turned into the bloodiest battle in the Russian-Ukrainian war at that date. The death toll in which was in tens of thousands of people. BBC sources claim that at a certain point, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, advocated withdrawing Ukrainian forces from the city. But at that time, Bakhmut turned into an important symbol for the Ukrainian political leadership. The image of the fortress Bakhmut was supposed to symbolize the steadfast of the soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces and their determination to stand for their native land to the end. According to the BBC, Zaluzhny did not receive the go-ahead to this proposal to leave the city, and bloody battles for Bakhmut continued until the city was captured by the Russians at the end of the May of 2023. Importantly, I'm going to here make a note, because while BBC claims this story, there are other sources that are disputing this story. Most notably saying that's like, if Zaluzhny, the chief general, made an order, does it mean that like some under-ranking officer under him just disputed his orders, which doesn't feel like it's an army we're talking about? So there are conflicting evidence onto who and how was dedicating their forces to Bakhmut. So it's just one type of the story. It is unclear at this point who did what. SYRSKY supporters considered the battles of Bakhmut a victory for Ukrainian weapons. If we had not restrained the enemy in Bakhmut, then we would have captured the entire Donetsk region in a matter of days. And heavy battles with Wagner ended in our victory because Wagner was completely destroyed even before Prigozhin's death, former Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar tells the BBC. The Bakhmut meat grinder really greatly undermined the combat effectiveness of the Wagner private military company. In one of the interviews at the time, SYRSKY even said that the history of the Wagner had come to an end. Apparently, the group under the commander of SYRSKY decided to take advantage of these circumstances and already in June 2023 launched its own attack on Bakhmut with the goal of recapturing it. According to the New York Times, in the summer of 2023, during one of the joint meetings, American military strategists recommended that Ukrainian generals not spread their forces between new attacks on Bakhmut and the upcoming major offensive in the southern direction. Journalists relying on their sources wrote that Valery Zaluzhny agreed with this logic. Again, disputed claim. There are claims that are saying that Zaluzhny instead was arguing with the NATO generals and saying that he knows best. However, in reality, the Ukrainian troops of SYRSKY's group made more and more attempts to recapture Bakhmut. SYRSKY himself at the time quite often communicated with Western media and personally defended the need to continue attacks on this dilapidated city. This is a matter of principle, a matter of honor. We lost many of our brother-in-arms, our military personnel, when we defended Bakhmut. We simply have to return it, he said in July 2023 in an interview with BBC. Around the same days, answering a question from the ABC television channel whether he could recapture Bakhmut, SYRSKY switched to English with a smile and said, "Yes, of course, I'm sure." As a result of the summer-autumn campaign, the Ukrainian armed forces failed to recapture Bakhmut, and some experts later named the diversion of parts of their resources to fight for it as one of the reasons, although not the main one, for the failure of the planned breakthrough of the Ukrainian military to the Sea of Azov. In turn, people from SYRSKY's entourage claimed that his group did not receive enough ammunition to carry out the tasks of liberating Bakhmut. The priority then was an offensive in the south. Before his appointment as commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, SYRSKY continued to head the OSGV Khortytsa, whose area of responsibility included Kupiansk and Liman, liberated in the fall of 2022. Here, Russian troops are constantly attacking Ukrainian positions. Our goals remain unchanged: holding our positions, exhausting the enemy by inflicting maximum losses of them. SYRSKY described the situation on the front sector entrusted to him in a January interview with Reuters. There are always chances. Even since fighting in 2014-2015 in Donbass, SYRSKY call sign has been Bars. I like this animal. It combines cunning, strength, courage, and is not afraid to engage in battle with the enemy, much larger than it's in weight and strength. We are in such situation right now, he said in an interview with TSN. I believe Bars is like snow leopard or something. So, And in general, Syrsky said in another interview that the Guardian newspaper, I have never fought against an enemy inferior to us in numbers. They always crushed us with numbers. This determines the defining feature of Syrsky, the military leader. People who know him says that the general is obsessed with planning, all his actions down to the smallest details. The main principle is to avoid frontal attacks, frontal actions. You just need to know your capabilities, strengths and weaknesses, and it's good to know the enemy, study him, use his strengths and his weaknesses, said Syrsky. And this is important because, again, one of the misconceptions about Syrsky is that he's a dumb general that just sends all of his troops into the frontal attack. However, when we look at the situation around Kharkiv, where Syrsky used troops to attack Russian in their weak spot, and then Syrsky also commenting about his philosophy and approach to the military, it's not the frontal attacks, actually. At one time, The Economist drew attention to the fact that Syrsky received his first military education at Moscow Higher Combined Arms Command School in the Soviet analog of the American West Point, along with many other commanders of the modern Russian army. But that's where the similarities end. His command style differs sharply from Soviet and Russian hierarchical principles. It professes NATO's principles of decentralized command and emphasizes the importance of morale. According to him, a modern commander needs to be constantly in touch. Every day he received 300 messages from the soldiers, the publication writes. At the same time, Alexander Syrsky, in a certain sense, looks like the opposite of Valery Zaluzhny. The former commander-in-chief was known among ordinary soldiers as Dad, an intercessor about whom the military spoke among themselves with obvious respect, but almost in a familiar tone. Syrsky, according to the BBC's interlocutors, is much less known among the masses of soldiers, and among those who have crossed paths with him, he has the reputation as a self-absorbed person who keeps his distance even from the closest of employees and his fighting comrades. People who communicated with Syrsky noted his asceticism in everyday life. He slept 4.5 hours a day. In an interview with The Guardian, he said that before the war he slept 5 nights and on weekdays 5.5. I guess it slept 5 hours a night. It is known about Syrsky that he wakes up at 5:20 in the morning, even if the day before he returned from leaving the front line at 2 in the morning. He starts the day with an hour of training on simulators. He even installed simulators at his headquarters. If circumstances permit, he goes in for sports again in the afternoon. I guess simulators here are meant as like gym equipment. Syrsky does not smoke, practically does not drink, and whenever possible he eats healthy. His office is always in perfect order. At every opportunity, Syrsky goes to the front line. His closest employees say. The general's unusual hobby originated from these trips. As a rule, they go to the front line very early and return very late. And so he noticed that in the east of Ukraine, the sky was especially beautiful. And so Syrsky began to record this beauty, the combination of a terrible war and the beauty of nature in photographs, says Hanna Malyar to the BBC. Syrsky sends photographs to his closest associates. The painter says that she is convinced him to organize an exhibition of his photographs after Ukraine's victory. But so far, he has not been able to obtain general consent. She was not been able to obtain the general's consent. Oh, there is a picture from Syrsky Private Archive, if you can see it. It is difficult to say what views Syrsky, who has never been one of the most public generals of Ukrainian army, adheres to. Unlike his predecessor, during almost 2 years of the Great War, he never appeared in a press with policy articles describing his positions regarding the army, the war and its future. In his first post after the appointment on his Telegram channel published on the February 9th, Syrsky called clear and detailed planning of actions of all military command and control bodies his main priority. The introduction of new technical solutions and scaling of successful experience, such as the use of unmanned systems and modern electronic warfare systems, is one of the future vectors for building victory in our war of liberation, he wrote. On the one hand, BBC correspondent Jonathan Bale writes that SYRSKY enjoys great respect in the army. He supposedly impressed the soldier with his focus, determination, and cunning. The general himself calls the people serving in the highest value of the Ukrainian army. People are the first value. Then come HIMARS, MLRS, air defense, artillery. He said in an interview with TSN. The life and health of military personnel have always been and are the main value of the Ukrainian army, says SYRSKY on a Telegram post. On the other hand, several officers of the armed forces of Ukraine with whom the BBC spoke say that SYRSKY has a reputation as an extremely tough commander, sometimes demanding more from the units entrusted to him than they can actually achieve. His hardline approach to warfare has made him unpopular with some soldiers, writes The Economist. The commander of the ground forces has firmly established the reputation of a person for whom completing tasks is more important than the number of lives required for this, states Ukrainska Pravda. SYRSKY supporters call such accusations uninformed informational operations initiated by both the Russians and his opponents inside of Ukraine. The BBC's interlocutors refuse to specify who exactly they are talking about. They say that during war it is not advisable to further inflate contradictions. Let law enforcement agencies deal with them. Journalists from Western publications who communicated with SYRSKY often mention his erudition. He's very interested in history. If you have time and you don't interrupt him, then he can tell historical stories, for example, from the era of Roman Empire, in the smallest details from an infinitely long time. He's just a unique memory, Hannah Mahler tells BBC. Well, as we learned from Tucker Carlson, maybe going into long ramblings about history is not the best quality to have. A Guardian correspondent who interviewed the general in a secret command post somewhere in the Kharkiv region last June noted that on the nightstand next to SYRSKY bed there was a volume of Karl von Clausewitz. Karl von Clausewitz is like an original philosopher of warfare. I will tell you this, having read Plutarch and other authors and watched documentaries about the history of ancient Greece, they use the same principles of war that we use in our time, because the basic principle of war remained the same. When you read about the Battle of the Cannes between Hannibal and the Romans, the principles are the same, outflanking the enemy, encircling the enemy, concentrating central efforts on the weakest points of the enemy's defenses. The need to carefully study the enemy, nothing changed. Okay, perhaps the complexity of the equipment and a degree of automation of process have changed. The publication reports his words. In a January interview with Reuters, SYRSKY noted that right now the war is moving into a new stage, the stage of high-tech warfare. And this, Western observers note, may indicate that the positions of the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine regarding the future of war are close to the point of view of his predecessor. In any case, in the same interview, SYRSKY talks about the transition of the Ukrainian army to the active defense tactics. When we don't just sit on defensive, but constantly counterattack, and in some directions we go on the offensive, and the enemy knows it. Answering the questions about whether, in the current circumstances, a turning point of the war in favor of Ukraine is possible, SYRSKY said, there are always chances, they need to be found and used. After the victory. Western media have long called Alexander SYRSKY the second most important Ukrainian general after Zaluzhny. The Russians also assess the significance of SYRSKY in their own way. In a recent interview with Reuters, he mentioned more than one attempt on his life. Russian pro-war Telegram channels reported at least twice about the liquidation of SYRSKY. Details of attempts on SYRSKY's life are not reported for security reasons. Let's just say we know what missile attacks are, he said. SYRSKY generally takes the enemy extremely seriously. Anyone who underestimates the Russians is doomed to failure, he said in an interview with The Economist. Since May last year, journalists have discovered that SYRSKY is one of the wanted on the Russian Military of Internal Affairs under some unnamed article of his criminal code of the Russian Federation. The general did not comment on this fact. SYRSKY was on the short list of contenders for the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in 2019. When newly elected President Volodymyr Zelensky appointed Ruslan Khomchak, and especially in July 2021, when Khomchak was replaced by Valery Zaluzhny, at the time SYRSKY's subordinate. Some behind-the-scenes political players may use this fact to try to stir up tensions between them. There are even rumors that the presidential administration is inclined to replace the popular but independent-minded Zaluzhny with his former leader, The Economist wrote back in December 2022. In a conversation with the publication, SYRSKY sharply comments on these rumors. The army is outside of politics. This is how it should be, and this is what the law requires. Whoever wrote about SYRSKY's envy or jealousy towards Zaluzhny simply does not know SYRSKY. This person simply has a different psyche. An acquaintance of the new commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine tells the BBC. Nevertheless, in Kyiv circles near the government that are rumors about Zelensky's good attitude towards SYRSKY personally. They say that Valery Zaluzhny could not count on this asset since the spring of 2022. Actually, one of the main problems of the new commander-in-chief will be competition in absentia with his dismissed predecessor. Ukrainian observers are already predicting at every step, successful or unsuccessful, he will be compared to Valery Zaluzhny. And this comparison will not be in favor of SYRSKY, they say. This did not happen under Zaluzhny, especially saying something like this did not happen under Zaluzhny, especially in the light of the fact that a large-scale breakthrough in military operations that could sharply increase the popularity of the new commander-in-chief does not seem to be expected, and Ukraine stands on the threshold of an intensification of mobilization that is not particularly popular in society. And SYRSKY's starting position in comparison with the former commander-in-chief is not impressive. A December survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology showed that 92% of Ukrainians trusted Valery Zaluzhny, and 72% of the country's residents opposed his resignation. For comparison, a third of Ukrainians trusted SYRSKY, and half simply did not know him. Adding fuel to the fire are the circumstances of Valery Zaluzhny's resignation, which, thanks primarily to the efforts of the presidential team's communications unit, has long since turned into a drawn-out series with a poor script. In this situation, Ukrainian experts say even if Zelensky were to appoint Napoleon instead of Zaluzhny, millions of Ukrainians would still consider this general a political appointee wholly dependent on the will of the president. However, building relationship in the polygon, SYRSKY, Zelensky, army, society is still waiting for us. And now SYRSKY seems to fully support Zelensky's positions on another, the most important issue for Ukraine, today's Ukraine. Last summer, when asked by ABC News, correspondent Jan Panel how he intended to end the war, SYRSKY replied, smiling, "We are committed to peace, but after our victory." The journalist was not satisfied with this formulation. He specified the question, share your vision of how the war will end physically. How will it look like? And SYRSKY answered, when Ukrainian flags fly over the entire length of our borders, including Crimea, the general answered quite seriously. So to sum up, in this article, we got introduced to absolutely different perspective of SYRSKY that you might have heard on the public media. SYRSKY is a calculated general, a general that is also well versed in NATO operations and how NATO operates. He was one of the frontrunners of implementation NATO standards in the Ukrainian military. SYRSKY is also very cunning. He prefers to attack enemy where he doesn't expect it, where his weak points are, which was shown in a Kharkiv operation. Obviously, he cannot turn the battlefield around because there are resource question, which is just an awful truth of the battlefield. And for that, we will hope that there will come supply of help, ammunition, and weapons from the allies, specifically the US as well. Thank you so much for watching this video, listening to this video. I love you all, guys. Second part coming as soon as I can, and I'll see you next time.